Welcome to the Animal Agenda. I'm Tom Kiesche, and this week we're bringing back Aimee Sadler, the founder and CEO of Dogs Playing for Life, DPFL. It's a 501c3 nonprofit with a mission to enhance the quality of life for shelter dogs and increase the life saving. You can go listen to the other episode, but let's just jump in, Aimee. Welcome back.
Thank you.
So a few disclaimers I have to say. I'm speaking as an individual in my own individual capacity. I'm a volunteer with several organizations. At least one of those organizations uses the services of DPFL. I've spoken to Aimee several times in the past, as well as members of her team. I've done workshop training with DPFL years ago. I follow many of the DPFL principles in playgroups that I've run, assisted with, or even when I've entered to record video. And lastly, while there may be some questions I know the answers to, I'm guessing that I'll continue to learn new things from Aimee. Hello again, Aimee.
Hello.
So last episode, we've talked a lot of things, a lot. And I recommend people go back and re-listen to that or check out some of the other interviews you've done. I mentioned the Shelter Me New Beginnings, which I thought did an excellent job of talking about your program. And it showed the program in action. Last time we talked about dog language. Can you go into that a little bit more? Dog language. What does that mean?
Well, I think for us, I just want to allow the dogs to behave normally and naturally, right? And so that includes, however, that they would be communicating with one another were we not standing over them, trying to interfere all the time and tell them how they should be better dogs than they are. Because I think they really, when we stay out of their way, they do a pretty good job at being dogs. And so, part of their communication is, asking each other to slow down. I always talk about how do dogs positively reinforce one another. Well, they just play and have a good time. Right? Typically, how they're communicating with one another is when they need to slow down or stop, right? And then they will be growling or snarling or snapping or lunging. And sometimes dogs are going to aggress for stinky reasons, just like people. And sometimes, there's a time and a place for aggression. One's picking on another one and one has to defend themselves. That can pop up now and again, but letting them be dogs and communicate the way that they want to get through all that and have healthy play and healthy interactions. That's the key.
And it's up to the handlers or lifeguards, as I like to call them in playgroups, because that's what I feel like when I'm running a playgroup, like a lifeguard. It's up to them to read the dog's language and not the dog to speak the person's language. Correct? I know I'm oversimplifying that, but.
And when you use the analogy of a lifeguard, what I think is so appropriate about that is that when you have lifeguards on a beach, they're not out there telling people how to have a good time. They're not telling them how they should engage with one another. They're not going out and teaching people how to swim, right? They're just stepping in when something is becoming problematic, when people are starting to behave inappropriately, that is not making it conducive to a healthy outing for others, and or when people are putting themselves at risk and they don't realize it, or when people are in trouble. And so that's exactly how I see our role as a playgroup handler.
And also, just to add on to that, if a lifeguard speaks English and two people horse playing around in the water speak a totally different language, it's not up to the lifeguard to speak that language, but to read the behavior of those two people.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And to then be able to communicate in a way that will be meaningful and effective, even though we don't understand the words. So there's ways to use your tone. There's ways to use your body language. There's ways to use your eye contact. And all of those things can convey to another living being that you're not speaking the same language, that you're asking something of them, and they can figure that out.
Right. And again, continuing on the lifeguard analogy, we don't want to overcorrect.
Exactly.
So, excellent. I was playing this game where I'd say a word and you would answer the question. I want to continue with that because there are certain things that I would love to hear your thoughts. And again, some of them are going to be vague on purpose.
Okay.
The word muzzling.
Oh, well, I wish that people would love muzzles and embrace muzzles a lot more. I think we feel like, it's this last resort thing. And it doesn't have to be. I know that in the context of playgroups for shelters, we are, when in doubt, we always want to go to a muzzle. If we are afraid, if this dog comes in, they're going to make a mistake. They could go to their mouth. They could hurt another dog. They could, whatever it might be. we're going to be pretty quick to get a muzzle on that dog. And we know that in that context, we don't have the time to train them and acclimate them to wearing a muzzle. So we have a very specific technique, and you can find this in our learning library, about how we can get a muzzle on a dog that doesn't know anything about that, so that we're not just showing up and shoving something at their face. So it makes it a much less argumentative, or it makes it less of a battle to quickly get a muzzle on, just to get them in the yard. And hopefully the intention is that even if they come in and they would have made mistakes, now they're not going to hurt anybody, and they can kind of move past that, and then we can see some sociability and that muzzle can come off, right? That what I always say to people is, if you're concerned about how a dog is going to do and if they're going to use their mouth inappropriately or not, and you don't put the muzzle on, what's the worst thing that happens, right? Your worst fears come true. They jump a dog, possibly cause injury to another dog or person, right? Trying to manage it. What is the worst thing that happens if we put a muzzle on a dog that we determine once we've let them in that they're actually pretty social, and then we can pop that muzzle off? What is the worst thing that happens in that scenario? Truth is, sometimes dogs are so distressed about the muzzle that they can't even engage with the other dogs. But oftentimes, once dogs start approaching them, they kind of forget about all that fussing and they start engaging with the dogs. But sometimes dogs are so concerned about that muzzle that it's not conducive, right? The worst thing that I see happen is sometimes they'll be trying to get it off and they'll tear their dew claws, right? Like they'll tear a dew claw or something. But aside from that, which is, that wasn't so much fun for the dog. But again, what is the lesser of two evils in those situations? So I really encourage people to consider muzzles as a really good stopgap when you just need a moment of making sure that this dog can't use its mouth to do harm, to see what's next and what's possible.
Hold on. Wait, you're saying or suggesting that purchasing a muzzle for under $100 is probably worth it, as opposed to thousands of dollars in possible legal fees? Is that what I'm hearing?
That was a good thing for you to add. Thank you. Yes.
So you and I know what we're talking about on some of the stuff, but maybe a listener doesn't know what a dew claw is. So I hate to say it, but what is a dew claw?
Fair. Some dogs have like it's almost like an extra toenail that's up their leg a little bit, and it kind of sticks out. It can be floppy. And then a lot of dogs, just naturally, they can get torn really easily. And so some people just remove it. It's like an extra, not so necessary. So people sometimes will remove them to prevent it from being torn and then the dog getting injured. So it's a drag when that happens, but it's nothing life-threatening. I think it's probably a little bit more of an exaggeration than when you clip a nail too closely and you clip the quick on a dog, for example. Just more exaggerated. It's just another toenail or finger that kind of got caught.
So in effort to sort of give a recap of last show, I'll just say these two words: the difference between a shelter dog and a home pet.
Oh, well, in the context of the work that we're doing, I think that's pretty obvious. A shelter dog is a dog that does not get the benefit of the creature comforts of being in a home and having that companionship and that reliability of a home and companionship. So when there's such a huge contextual difference. To be honest with you, when I started training the dogs in the shelter environment, I was frustrated for the first 6 months because I considered myself to be pretty successful as a dog trainer. I'm like, why is this stuff that works for me so well out in the world with my private clients? Why am I just struggling to get through to these dogs as quickly and as meaningfully and as lastingly as I can when they're out and about and at home with their owners? And it came to me, I'm like, oh, so people do not like when I say this, but one of the things that makes our program stand out is the fact that we always preach in the shelter environment, we should not be relying upon our relationship with the dogs to be the reason they're progressing. That does not mean that we don't encourage everybody that's working with shelter dogs. Of course, build your relationships with them, but you need to understand something about clinical training because they're in adverse conditions and we don't want them dependent upon us as individuals. We want to help them learn to not be so afraid and to be able to function in this environment and for others. So it's important that we don't rely upon that relationship to be the reason that they're progressing. Did I answer that correctly for you?
Yeah, and I would say that ties back to the lifeguard.
Yes.
We don't have a relationship with every lifeguard at every beach we go to, or the majority of us don't, and that's not why we behave. Mm-hmm. We learn to behave despite who the lifeguard is.
Exactly. Because everybody wants safety all the way around.
You're listening to The Animal Agenda on KPFK. I'm Tom Kiesche, and we are chatting with Aimee Sadler, the founder and CEO of Dogs Playing for Life. This is a continuation of our conversation from last week. So if you have any questions, go check out last week's episode or go to their website, dogsplayingforlife.org. You can find out plenty of information there. Aimee, let's now get into play styles because a lot of people are confused by some of the names and some of the behaviors. So play styles, go.
So we have 4 of them that we've come up with. And this was for the purpose for me, of teaching other people. And I was trying to think, how do I teach people why and how I choose to let dogs in together? And so what came to mind is their style of play, their energy level. Those are the 2 primary things for me. So I had to kind of come up with some names. And so gentle and dainty are the ones that it's kind of like the equivalent of dogs or kids that are sitting around having a tea party. There's not a lot of contact, not super high energy. They'll enjoy being around each other, but they don't want it to get too rowdy. They get a little bit overwhelmed if things are too intense, right? Just a tea party. Then we've got push and pull, which is, imagine that, are dogs that love a good game of tag, right? So we have a lot of dogs that have herding tendencies, will tend to be push and pull players. These dogs will tend to want to stay on their feet. They're not going to, go belly up and be rolling around a lot. They're very responsive to and triggered by movement, right? So they'll start and stop a lot together. You'll see some of that demand barking, like what, like they want to make each other move, but it's basically a game of tag, right? Then we have the rough and rowdies, which are the grapplers, right? It's like the WWE, is it WWE or WWF of the dog world, whatever that is. And these guys, these are the ones that most people are uncomfortable letting them just play the way they want because the energy can get really high and they're literally grappling. We want them dragging each other around by body parts because they are practicing appropriate use of their mouth and good bite inhibition, right? They're telling each other when you're being too pinchy with me, but they are banging into each other. The energy's high. They're running, chasing, tumbling, and it's like constant high energy activity. And when you've got 2 of those and it's mutual, it's awesome. Like I love to let it rip, but people get nervous with the energy and the physicality of it, The one that is the strangest for people to kind of figure out, and I wish I had a better name for it, but we seek and destroy is what we call it. And it's more of a role-playing model. And what's interesting, one's the chaser, one's the chasee, typically. And they play those roles very, very distinctly. It can look like a combination of push and pull and rough and rowdy, because there is some like chasing and then kind of grappling or like I caught you and I'm mushing you into the ground, like pretending I got you, but it's all in play. And typically the one that is the role of the prey dog, right? The one that's being chased, the chasee, is usually the one that is controlling the game because they're starting and stopping based upon, when they're into it. And that's the hardest one for people to identify. And but it is the one that I will tend to interrupt the most because I do want to make sure that everybody's having a good time and that it's not getting too serious.
Yeah, those I inappropriately call the victim dogs that love playing the victim. And I find that sometimes that energy stirs the pot a little bit too much.
It's true. That's why that's the play side that I would tend to be monitoring and possibly interrupting more frequently than others, because sometimes the other dogs in the yard can misread that. Even though the 2 are very clear about what they're doing, sometimes other dogs can get pretty excited by it.
Okay, so much to talk about here. We could literally talk about this for hours. But I've seen dogs come in one day rough and rowdy, and the next day they are gentle, dainty. Or you take 2 dogs out of the play group and put 2 new dogs in, and the behavior changes dramatically. Or one week they're the victim dog playing the victim, and the next dog they're totally something else. So how does Dogs Playing for Life, the professionals, and they are professionals, they are staff, how do they recognize that and adjust?
Well, number one is we have no hard set rules. Like we will provide notes on the dog. So if I've done playgroup one day and then Tom, you're going to come on and run playgroup the next day and you're going to look at my notes. I want to be sure that I'm informing you well from the experience that I had with the dogs this day. We know, just like us, they can wake up on the wrong side of the bed, so to speak, the wrong side of the veranda. And so sometimes they're just not in the mood that day or whatever. So we definitely, every day is new, and you observe the dogs today, right? And you don't make assumptions about, oh, this is this dog's best friend. There was one thing that I want to caution people about is that we're really looking to have the dogs practicing their sociability while they're sheltered, right? So we don't want to get into the habit of the same dogs in the same yard, because you might create by accident small packs on one competitive territory. And then it might be more difficult to introduce a dog. So you want them meeting different dogs. You want a flow. You want sociability to be practiced.
Let's talk about something that maybe people who aren't volunteers or don't go to shelters might want to hear. And that is, what is the difference between a play group and a dog park? And are you pro dog park?
I am pro the spirit of dog parks. I love dog parks if we felt confident that the right dogs would be there. Unfortunately, what makes dog parks, a danger sometimes is that people have their dogs there that are not appropriate to be there. But I would never say that I don't. When I go to a dog park, I go to dog parks with my dog all the time, but I observe the dogs that are in there. And if I see a dog or an owner and a dog dynamic that I feel like, that's not the right, then we skip it that day. But I have the eye for that, right? So I think there is a fantastic, I'm going to plug Dog People in Santa Monica. He has it's a dog park, it's a club, it's a membership that you join. So he solves for that problem. So the dogs are screened to be there. He has his referees that are there, and people get to hang out with their dogs, but it's a controlled environment. And you know that the dogs that are there are the appropriate dogs to be there. And I think that that's a fantastic model. I wish we had a lot more of that around the country. Basically supervision, right? With people that know what they're doing.
So basically, it's a park with lifeguards.
Yes, exactly.
I'm going to keep going back to this lifeguard thing, by the way, because it's perfect.
I think it's adorable. He calls them referees.
I love that name. Mm-hmm. So the other thing about dog parks, I think people don't realize is, and you kind of tipped on that, but you don't know the condition of the dogs as well. You don't know who's had their rabies shots or their inoculations or anything about the other dogs, where at the shelter, you at least have a baseline of the dogs themselves, correct? Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So how do I say this? The thing I love about play groups, and they're not play styles, but they're like the personalities, like hall monitor. Mm-hmm. The one that fascinates me is conflict driven. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about those and how you label them? What are those? If they're not play styles, what's a hall monitor and what category is a hall monitor?
It's interesting. So we have, if you go onto our website, you'll see we have our playgroup notes. And at the bottom, there's like some of our legend, and it's expanded a lot more. So these are some very unscientific terms we have, such as this dog as a kick me sign. So it's a KMS dog, right? All of these different little descriptors that we use. So once we've identified their play style, we know something about their energy. We then categorize them for how we would represent them to the public, like the potential adopters. So is this dog social, tolerant, selective, defensive, or offensive, right? And within those kind of labelings, right, the selective one specifically, if we call a dog selective, what that means is this dog isn't appropriate for every single other kind of dog. When you have social and tolerant dogs, those dogs pretty much should be pretty interchangeable. You're just going to match play styles and energy, but these are dogs that should be able to all intermingle once everybody's first yayas are out and the energy is balanced. With the selective dogs, you need to be mindful of what dogs you're putting them into and what play group you're putting them into. And therefore, I'd have to give you notes, Tom. If you were coming the day after me and you saw that these 6 dogs are rated as selective and that's all I told you, you wouldn't know what to do. You'd have to start from scratch and figure that out on your own. So I'm always going to give these other descriptors, such as conflict driven. What that means is that this dog loves to play, loves to be in play groups. But if a fight breaks out over there, they have this inclination to jump in, right? So they're driven by conflicts. They might not even be the one to start the conflict, but that's something you have to be mindful of and very careful. So that means we want to be having them in yards where things aren't going to be sparky, right? Or you're not having them in a yard when you're trying to work through a problem dog that's maybe overcorrecting because they might misread that and then jump in and cause a problem, right? So the list is long. If there's any others you want me to describe, I will, but I could get way too in the weeds.
No, but if people are interested, they can find out where?
Well, we have on our website, there's a resources tab, and you can look at our playgroup notes, and some of those terms are in a legend at the bottom of the playgroup notes. But additionally, what I would say is join us for one of our playgroup webinars. And so there's a schedule of the webinars that we have coming up. We just did the playgroup one, so it'll be a couple of months before we do it again. But you can always, and that is the full presentation that we give when we're live and doing a seminar. So it's the soup to nuts, the what, why, and how, and very detailed. It's a 3-hour presentation, so it's a lot.
This is the Animal Agenda on KPFK. I'm Tom Kiesche, and we're chatting with Aimee Sadler, the founder and CEO of Dogs Playing for Life. If you missed the first episode, go back and listen to it. Aimee, we're getting close to the end again, and again, we could talk forever. But I want to be specific on my questions because I have limited time. One conversation I have with different volunteers is affection, treats, and toys. And they often say, well, these two dogs are kenneled together so they can have toys, or we can be affectionate with them, or we can give them treats when they're next to each other. Your thoughts and feelings about affection, treats, and toys, both in play groups, dog parks, and with dogs who may be kenneled together.
I think that you have to assess each of those situations. So in our play groups, we do not allow for food, toys. And affection is only, it's not that we won't ever offer the dogs affection when they're out there, but we're very mindful that it's an individual dog that's come to us. And if a bunch of dogs start gathering around us, then we're going to withdraw our affection at that time because it can trigger resource guarding, right? Dogs might resource guard a person. They might be competitive for that. We might create some competition for that resource, right? Even if they're not guarding it. And so just because two dogs, even if two dogs are playing beautifully together in the play group, doesn't necessarily mean that they can co-house together. That's a whole different dynamic, right? Some people, they want to be the only child, right? And I think dogs are exactly the same way. They don't want to share space with another canine companion, but they would like to go to the playground with another canine companion, right?
So you mean if I was hanging out with my buddy at the beach and we were roughing around and having a good time at the beach, it doesn't automatically mean we'd be good in the same room, living together 24 hours a day?
Yes, thank you for that addition. That's great. You're correct.
So resource guarding, continue with why you don't do resource guarding, just to hammer that home.
Well, when we're taking dogs in a stressful environment and we're trying to get them out to a play yard to let them play successfully with one another, we want to set them up for success. So we want to minimize adding anything that could trigger conflict between them while they're out in that play yard so they can just focus on positive, healthy social engagement with one another. So we're not going to bring treats in. We're not going to introduce toys in. It's frustrating to me when people bring their dog to the dog park and start playing fetch because I think it's very insensitive to the fact that could be very triggering for other dogs, but it's what people do. If I had my way, those things would not be allowed in dog parks. That this would be time for the dogs to play with each other and be engaging with their owners, and that would be what that's about.
What is one success story that stands out to you?
There's so many, but I can tell you what happens to us. I think one seminar in my career, and it was a very unique, it was a little shelter up north that had kind of older, a lot of medical cases. So it was really kind of silly that we even went there to do a playgroup seminar for them. This is the only time it didn't happen. Every single other time that we do a playgroup seminar at a shelter, they have dogs labeled as dog aggressive and not appropriate to go to a home with another dog. And every single time we will find at least one that ends up being a playgroup rock star that is great with everyone. And people realize that, wow, how many of our dogs in the past have we mislabeled and how many obstacles have we created for them for opportunities to get into a home because we didn't understand, we misunderstood all of these things like on-leash reactivity and barrier reactivity and all that kind of stuff. So I can say that is, we see that one over and over and over and over and over again.
I see that as well. At every shelter I volunteer at, we see dogs surrendered for being aggressive to animals, and they are playgroup rock stars. And as I've said to many people on this show and in public and while showing dogs, it's the handler. It's the handler. It's the handler. And it's how we introduce dogs. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to get into how to introduce dogs. And we haven't been able to really talk about leash reactivity and barrier reactivity. But if people are interested in these topics, where should they go to find out more?
Well, we have webinars about each of those things separately. We have an on-leash reactivity webinar. We have lots of webinars. So it's on our website, Dogs Playing for Life, all spelled out, .com or .org. You can get to it either way. And there's a schedule of all the material that we cover. And those are very targeted.
Aimee, thank you again for being on the show. We could literally talk for hours.
I think so. That would be true.
I know so. Mm-hmm. And I'd love to have you back at some point. But what I would like before the next time is to allow listeners to maybe send in comments or questions that they have. So would you be game for that possibly in the future?
Of course. Love it.
Well, Aimee, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
This is Tom Kiesche, and you've been listening to The Animal Agenda right here on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, or streaming online. It's every Wednesday at 2:30 p.m. Hey, our guest this week has been Aimee Sadler, the founder and CEO of Dogs Playing for Life. Special thanks to producer Marlena Bond. If you have questions, suggestions, comments, or want to know more, write comments at kpfk.org or go to the Animal Agendas page on Facebook. You can find out more about me, Tom Kiesche, through my link tree. Please support listener sponsor KPFK by donating online at kpfk.org or by calling 818-985-5735. That's 818-985-KPFK. We truly appreciate it.